Shattered Secrets. As James Adams turned the key in the lock, the door to his house slowly creaked open, releasing a scent of lavender that felt both foreign and unsettling. The joy he had felt just moments ago about his promotion was now replaced by a vague sense of unease. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Saturday morning. Usually, at this time, his wife Emily would be chatting on the phone or preparing a late breakfast, with a clatter of dishes in the kitchen and music playing in the living room. But today, there was nothing, no noise, no movement, only that smell, pervasive and ominously familiar. James stepped inside, feeling a strange tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. As he climbed the stairs, everything seemed normal, too normal, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But there was something wrong with this silence, something off in the way the shadows fell on the walls, in the way the clock on the nightstand ticked just a bit too loudly. He froze by the bedroom door when he heard voices. Two voices, close and all too familiar. His heart skipped a beat, then began to pound wildly in his chest as he recognized them, Emily and his brother, Mark. "Do you really think he'll ever figure it out?" Mark's voice was laced with a mocking laugh. "Oh, he's always been so naive," Emily replied, her tone dripping with disdain. "All these years, he's been too busy with his career to notice anything going on around him. Fool." Each word pierced James like a knife. He stood in the shadows, paralyzed by shock and rage. They kept laughing, their voices blending into a hideous noise that echoed in his mind. All his dreams, everything he had built, shattered in that instant, breaking apart like glass. In that moment, James made a decision. He would not reveal himself. He would not burst into the room, would not scream or confront them. He knew that the plan for revenge was already forming in his mind, cold and precise. They would regret every word, every look, every touch. Without making a sound, he retreated and left the house, closing the door behind him as quietly as he had opened it. At the moment, the lock clicked shut. So did his heart. Forever. James now had time and a plan. The city streets blurred past, shrouded in the gray mist of early morning. James sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was miles away. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The cold fury that clenched his heart was gradually overtaking the initial shock, spreading through his body like ice. He replayed every word, every mocking laugh, every smile he had overheard in the bedroom. How long had it been going on? Weeks? Months? Years? James tried to recall when he might have first noticed something amiss, but his memory offered no answers. Everything had seemed normal, routine, just as it should be in their marriage. Work, home, occasional weekends together. Wasn't that what they had wanted, what they had dreamed of? But now, every moment, every memory felt like a lie, carefully crafted and skillfully hidden. He pulled over by an old park where he and Emily used to walk, talking about their future, making plans for life. James didn't choose this place by accident. It had once symbolized everything they had, everything that was now destroyed. Stepping out of the car, he walked down the familiar path to the bench where they had once sat together. Now it was empty, just like his heart. He sat down and closed his eyes, allowing his thoughts to drift. Here, in the silence, he gave himself a few moments to let go of the anger, the pain, the betrayal. Emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but he knew he couldn't give in to them now. This was the moment when he needed to make a decision, and he did. James would not be a victim. He would not wallow in self-pity, would not shake his fists and shout accusations. He would choose a different path, the path of cold calculation and a precise plan. They wouldn't know when he would strike, but the blow would be strong and devastating. He swore to himself on that bench that he would never let them see his plans. He would become a different person, create a new life and a new identity. And when they were on their knees, when everything they held dear was destroyed, James would reveal who had orchestrated their downfall. But not before. Rising from the bench, James took one last look at the park. The silence no longer troubled him. Now it was the silence before the storm. He returned to his car with a clear purpose in mind. This was not just about revenge. This was the beginning of the end for those who had dared to betray him. He drove away, leaving behind the weak James Adams. Ahead of him lay a new path, a new man, and a new plan. A plan that would destroy them. 7 long years had passed. Time that might have seemed like an eternity to most people had flown by for James in what felt like the blink of an eye. During those years, he had transformed into someone entirely different. The old James Adams, quiet and unassuming, was gone for good. In his place stood Daniel Blackwood, a successful, confident businessman with a flawless image and powerful connections. These 7 years had not been spent merely observing his enemies. James had meticulously gathered information, studied Emily and Mark's weaknesses, waiting for the moment when their lives would start to unravel. He watched as Mark, consumed by his gambling addiction, sank deeper into debt, and as Emily, after losing her job, struggled to maintain the luxurious lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. But all of this was just a part of his plan, one of the many steps he had carefully crafted every night. Changing his name and appearance, James also changed his life. He left his old city behind, built a new business from scratch, and became a man no one could connect to his past. Now, he was Daniel Blackwood, a successful and respected entrepreneur whose wealth grew with each passing year. But success alone did not satisfy him. It was merely a means to an end, the final point that was now directly in front of him. One evening, sitting in his office, Daniel opened the documents his personal assistant had brought him. These were debt records belonging to Mark and financial reports detailing Emily's current situation. He looked at them with cold detachment, knowing that his time had come. Everything was ready. They were on the brink of ruin, and he could crush them with a single blow. But not yet. He needed to move carefully, with no mistakes. Instead of rushing, he began manipulating their lives from the shadows. Through shell companies, he bought up Mark's debts, gradually stripping him of all his assets. He engineered Emily's dismissal from her job through his influential connections. But these were just the opening moves. They had no idea who was behind their misfortunes. In the rare moments when Daniel allowed himself to relax, he would think back to 7 years ago, to that day when he first realized that revenge would be his only goal. At first, it had been difficult, holding himself back from immediate action, suppressing the desire to lash out. But now, after years of waiting, he had learned to take pleasure in watching them suffer, savoring the moment when they would finally be cornered. Every day brought him closer to executing his plan, and he knew that when the moment arrived, neither Mark nor Emily would be able to escape their fate. Meanwhile, he continued working, building his empire, and preparing for the final act. The time had come for the first major move. Daniel opened his laptop and sent a few emails, simple keystrokes, and Mark and Emily's lives were about to change forever. He closed the laptop and took a satisfied sip of whiskey. Watching their downfall was just as gratifying as planning his revenge. Now, all he had to do was wait for the dominoes to start falling, one by one. Early in the morning, Mark's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reluctantly opened his eyes and, groaning, reached for the device. The message on the screen was from his financial advisor, and each word felt like a stab to his gut. "We've lost everything. All assets have been sold, and the debts have been acquired by an unknown company. Call me immediately." Mark froze, unable to process the information. Panic set in, and his heart raced. How could this have happened? Just yesterday, he had a plan, a risky but feasible way to pay off some of the debt. But now, everything he relied on had been obliterated in an instant. He frantically dialed his advisor's number, his hands trembling. The ringing seemed to last forever before the voice on the other end finally picked up, raspy and anxious. "Mark, I've been trying to reach you all night. It's worse than we thought. Someone bought out all your debts through several anonymous companies. They acted quickly, without warning. You no longer own your share in the family business. Everything has been transferred to the new owner, and there's nothing we can do to reverse it." Mark was silent, struggling to comprehend what he was hearing. His life was unraveling right before his eyes, and he was powerless to stop it. One question echoed in his mind: who did this? Who was so ruthless and calculated to strike from the shadows and leave him with nothing? Meanwhile, across town, Emily Adams was rushing to work. She had grown accustomed to the changes in her life, losing her previous job, the financial struggles that followed James's departure. But she remained confident that she could manage, as she always had. Dressed in her best suit, she hoped to make a strong impression at today's meeting, which was critical for her new project and her chance to regain some stability. But as soon as she walked into the office building, she sensed something was wrong. The usual friendly smiles from her colleagues were replaced with awkward glances and hidden pity. Ignoring them, she headed straight to her office. Before she could even sit down, her phone rang. "Mrs. Adams, this is Linda from HR. We need you to come to our office immediately. I'm sorry, but it's about your position." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead as she made her way to the elevator. In the HR office, Linda greeted her with a forced smile and an envelope in hand. "We regret to inform you, Mrs. Adams, that due to recent budget cuts, your project has been terminated. You will receive a severance package, but effective immediately. You are no longer employed by the company." Emily opened the envelope, her vision blurring as she read the contents. Yet another door had slammed shut in her life. Over the years, she had learned to fight. But now, she felt her strength waning. She left the office, feeling as though the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Meanwhile, Daniel Blackwood, observing from afar, knew that Mark and Emily were reeling in confusion and fear. This was only the first strike, the initial step in their downfall, and they had no idea who was behind their growing misfortunes. Daniel smiled as he closed the report on his desk. The moment when everything became real, when his dreams of revenge turned into action, had arrived. And this was only the beginning. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, clutching the envelope that had shattered her world. Just that morning, she had been confident she could hold onto the remnants of her once luxurious life. But now, with her career in ruins, she realized how fragile her world had always been. The entire day she spent lost in anxious thoughts, searching for solutions, but none seemed viable. Inside, a growing sense of desperation took hold. When Mark returned home, his face was pale with exhaustion and stress. He looked defeated and made no effort to hide it. Emily glanced at him, her eyes silently asking the question, what else could possibly go wrong? "You won't believe what happened," Mark muttered as he threw a stack of papers onto the table. "We've lost everything. Someone bought out all my debts and took over my share of the family business. It's all gone, Emily. We have nothing left." Emily felt something inside her break. These were the last words she ever expected to hear. Her entire future, which she had relied on, had crumbled like a house of cards. She stood up from the bed, walked over to the window, and stared out at the serene sky, where not a single cloud marred the view. Inside her, a storm raged, but outwardly, she remained calm. For the first time in a long while, real fear gripped her. Everything they had built together, everything she had betrayed James for, was destroyed. She began to realize that the life she had thought was stable and secure had been nothing but an illusion. Mark collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. Emily noticed how his hands trembled, how his face was slick with sweat. She realized that he was desperate, that he was broken. But what terrified her most was that she had no strength left to support him. Hours passed before Emily could gather her thoughts. She knew they needed to find a way out, to do something, anything, to save themselves. But time was against her. Too many questions remained unanswered. Who was behind this? Why was everything happening now? She called one of her old acquaintances, a prominent lawyer she had known for years. The conversation was brief, but the outcome was devastating. "There's nothing I can do, Emily," he said. "These transactions are airtight. Your debts were bought by an anonymous corporation. We have no way to challenge it. I'm sorry." As she hung up the phone, it became clear to her that they were trapped, ensnared in a web woven with meticulous precision. A cold shiver ran down her spine as a terrifying thought took root. Could this be related to James? The idea pierced her like a bolt of lightning. She shared her thoughts with Mark, who initially dismissed them, but gradually began to consider the possibility as he grasped the enormity of their predicament. "You think this is James? But why? After all these years?" Emily's voice was tinged with bitterness as she replied, "He was never one to forgive. If this really is him, then he's been planning this all along. And now he's starting to destroy us, piece by piece." Mark finally grasped the full weight of their situation. If this was indeed James's revenge, they were facing a force they couldn't hope to defeat. He slammed his fist on the table, his anger turning to despair. "We can't let him win. There has to be a way to fix this." But deep down, Mark knew the truth. They were facing an enemy far more formidable than they had ever imagined. Emily looked into his eyes and saw the same dread that filled her own. They were like two drowning people, grasping at anything to stay afloat. But time was slipping through their fingers like sand. Meanwhile, Daniel Blackwood, who had been carefully monitoring their every move, knew that their struggle was futile. They might try to fight, but every step they took had already been anticipated and accounted for. He was always one step ahead, savoring their helplessness like a cat playing with a trapped mouse. He held all the power, and he intended to use it to the very end. The house was engulfed in a suffocating silence. Emily and Mark sat across from each other at the kitchen table, scattered with a mess of papers, bills, debt notices, financial reports. The air around them seemed thick with dread, mirroring their internal turmoil. Both of them looked exhausted, like people who had fought too long and lost too much. Emily broke the silence, her voice shaky but laced with urgency. "We have to do something, Mark. We can't just sit here and watch everything fall apart." Mark lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with exhaustion and simmering anger. He wasn't the man who could come up with a solution. His world was collapsing, and he had no idea how to put it back together. "What do you suggest, Emily?" He spat bitterly. "We have nothing. The business is gone. All of it. You lost your job. We can't pay these debts." Mark's words hung in the air like a sentence. Emily bit her lip, trying to hold back the rising tide of panic. She couldn't afford to break down, even though everything felt hopeless. One thought pulsed in her mind. James, could he be behind all of this? But it seemed impossible. He had vanished from their lives 7 years ago, and they hadn't heard from him since. Just then, their conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Emily flinched, then quickly reached for the receiver. On the other end was the lawyer she had contacted after her dismissal. What he told her next was something she never expected to hear. "Emily, I'm afraid the news is bad. We've traced the ownership of Mark's shares, and they now belong to a company registered under the name Daniel Blackwood. We tried to dig deeper, but there's very little information available. What's strange is that his rise in the business world began around the same time you separated from James Adams." Emily turned pale as the realization hit her like a sledgehammer. James's name, spoken so suddenly, sent a primal fear coursing through her. In her mind, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Someone was deliberately ruining their lives, and that someone could very well be James. She recalled the cold gleam in his eyes when he discovered the betrayal, and suddenly she understood that his disappearance hadn't been an escape, but the beginning of something far more terrifying. She shared her thoughts with Mark, who at first dismissed the idea, but as the enormity of their downfall sank in, he began to reconsider. "You think all of this is James's doing, but why now, after all these years?" Emily's voice was laced with bitterness as she replied, "He's not the kind of man who forgives. If it's really him, he's been planning this for years, and now he's striking back, piece by piece." Mark, finally grasping the gravity of their situation, slammed his fist on the table in frustration. The anger in his eyes gave way to despair. "We can't let him win. There has to be a way to stop this." But deep down, both of them knew the truth. They were up against a force they couldn't hope to defeat. Emily looked at Mark and saw the same fear in his eyes that gripped her own heart. They were like two drowning people, clinging to anything they could find, but the tide was rising and time was running out. Meanwhile, Daniel Blackwood, the man they once knew as James, watched their struggles from a distance, coldly calculating their every move. He knew their fight was in vain. Every step they took had been anticipated, every countermeasure already neutralized. He was always one step ahead, relishing their desperation. The power was in his hands, and he had no intention of letting it go. As the days passed, the tension between Emily and Mark grew unbearable. The weight of their crumbling world pushed them further into despair. Every decision they made only seemed to accelerate their downfall. Their once strong bond had become strained, fragile under the pressure. Arguments erupted over the smallest things, and the blame shifted back and forth like a pendulum. The final straw came when Emily confronted Mark about his gambling debts. Debts she had just discovered were far worse than she'd imagined. "How could you have kept this from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with rage and disbelief. "We're losing everything because of you." Mark, in turn, lashed out, his own guilt fueling his anger. "Don't you dare put this all on me, Emily. You were the one who pushed James away. If it weren't for your betrayal, none of this would be happening." The argument spiraled out of control, with both of them hurling accusations and insults, each word a dagger meant to wound. In the end, they both fell silent, realizing the futility of their anger. The damage was done, and there was no going back. In his quiet, luxurious office, Daniel Blackwood knew that the final phase of his plan was near. The pieces were all in place, and soon, Emily and Mark would face the full consequences of their actions. He had waited years for this moment, and the time for reckoning was almost at hand. The courtroom was vast, with high ceilings and tall windows that allowed bright daylight to stream in, casting harsh shadows across the polished wooden floor. Emily sat on the defendant's bench, the light almost blinding in its intensity, as if it were exposing every secret, every sin she had tried to bury. Beside her sat Mark, pale and gaunt, his face devoid of any hope. Across from them stood an army of lawyers, led by the man they knew as Daniel Blackwood. But to Emily and Mark, he was James, the man whose name had become their curse. James stood at the plaintiff's podium, his posture rigid and composed. Dressed in a sharp suit, he exuded confidence and control, his expression unreadable except for the cold fire that burned in his eyes. The legal battle, initiated by him, was the culmination of years of preparation. This was the moment he had been waiting for, since the day he walked out of the house where he had been betrayed. Now, he was here to finish what he had started. James's lead attorney, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper voice, began to speak. Her words were delivered with the precision of a scalpel, each one cutting deeper than the last. We present evidence that Mrs. Adams and Mr. Mark Adams Sr. conspired deliberately and with malice to deceive my client, keeping him in the dark about his familial circumstances and depriving him of his rightful claims. These actions have caused him severe emotional and financial harm. Each word felt like a hammer blow to Emily, but this was only the first strike. Laid out before the judge were documents containing everything James had uncovered. Photographs, recorded conversations, bank statements that detailed the financial manipulations Emily and Mark had engaged in while James was still in the picture. But the most devastating piece of evidence was the result of a DNA test, confirming that their daughter, Leah, whom James had once loved as his own, was in fact Mark's child. Emily felt the ground shift beneath hers. Her world crumbled. She had known that James would uncover the truth, but she never imagined he would unleash his fury with such precision, such unrelenting force. She glanced at James and saw nothing but cold determination in his eyes, a man who had meticulously planned every detail of this destruction. The judge, a stern man with an impassive face, examined the evidence presented by James's team. He took his time, carefully considering each document, but the tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second. When he finally looked up, there was no doubt in his eyes. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the actions of the defendants were intentional and malicious. As such, I rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Daniel Blackwood. The defendants are to transfer all remaining assets to the plaintiff, and they are also ordered to pay damages as determined by the court. Furthermore, Mrs. Emily Adams is stripped of all parental rights over the child. Leah, given the circumstances revealed here today, Emily's breath caught in her throat. Everything she once had was gone. Her daughter, her home, her money. All of it now belonged to James. Mark sat beside her, equally shattered. His attempts to maintain his composure had failed. He now fully understood that they had lost everything. James turned to face them, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with the same icy resolve that had brought him here. He stepped closer, leaned in, and spoke in a low, almost whispering voice. "This is just the beginning. You destroyed my life, and now I've destroyed yours. I wanted you to feel it, to suffer through every moment, just as I did." Emily couldn't find the strength to respond. She knew the game was over. James turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them behind in their ruined world. Now he had everything, and they had nothing. As the doors closed behind him, Emily realized that the revenge was complete, and it was absolute. Emily sat alone in what used to be her living room, now stripped of everything that once made it feel like a home. The walls, bare and cold, seemed to close in on her, reflecting the emptiness she felt inside. The house that had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and the comforts of a well-lived life now felt more like a tomb, a place where the memories of what had been were suffocating reminders of what she had lost. Mark had left immediately after the court ruling. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't even looked back. The silence between them had been as final as the judge's gavel. Emily couldn't blame him. In his eyes, she was as much to blame for their downfall as he was, perhaps more. After all, it had been her decisions, her betrayals, that had set everything in motion. Every day was a reminder of her failures. The home she had fought to keep was gone. The daughter she had loved more than anything was no longer hers, and the life she had built had been completely destroyed. The luxurious lifestyle she had once cherished was now nothing but a memory, and even that memory was tainted by the realization of how fragile it had been all along. The court's ruling had not only taken away her possessions, it had taken away her dignity, her sense of self. Emily had prided herself on being strong, resilient, able to face any challenge. But this was more than she could bear. Leah was now living with James. No, Daniel. And there was nothing Emily could do to change that. Every attempt she made to reach out to Leah was met with silence. Phone calls went unanswered. Letters were returned unopened. Leah had been cut off from her completely. A punishment that felt more brutal than anything else James had done. Alone in the house, Emily's thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the events that had led her to this moment. She could see it all so clearly now. The lies she had told, the deceit she had spun, the selfish choices she had made. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her family, but in truth, she had been protecting herself. And now that truth had come crashing down around her. Meanwhile, in his new home, Daniel Blackwood, formerly James Adams, sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of success he had fought so hard to achieve. The wealth, the power, the influence. It was all his. But the satisfaction he had once imagined it would bring was nowhere to be found. He had gotten his revenge, executed it with precision, but the victory felt hollow. Leah was living with him now, but their relationship was strained. She was confused, hurt, unsure of who her father really was. Daniel tried to be the parent she needed, but the distance between them grew with each passing day. He could see the questions in her eyes, the unspoken doubts. She didn't understand why she couldn't see her mother, why their world had suddenly changed so drastically. And Daniel didn't know how to answer her without revealing the full extent of what he had done. Sitting in his study, Daniel opened a book he hadn't touched in years, an old favorite that he and Emily used to read together in the early days of their marriage. The pages were worn, the cover frayed, but it was a reminder of a time when things had been simpler, when they had been happy. As he turned the pages, memories flooded back, memories of laughter, of shared dreams, of love that seemed unbreakable. But those memories only deepened the emptiness he felt now. He closed the book and set it aside, staring out the window at the city lights below. The empire he had built was impressive, but it was built on the ruins of his former life. He had destroyed Emily and Mark, but in doing so, he had destroyed something within himself. The man who had once been James Adams no longer existed. In his place was Daniel Blackwood, a man driven by revenge, but now left with nothing but regret. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel began to see the full cost of his actions. He had won the battle, but lost the war. The power and wealth he had accumulated meant nothing without the people who had once mattered to him. Leah was the only part of his old life he still had, but even that bond was fraying. The darkness he had sought to cast over Emily and Mark had seeped into his own soul, leaving him cold, empty, and alone. Emily, too, was living in a prison of her own making. The walls of her once grand home now felt like barriers, keeping her from the world outside. She had lost everything that had defined her, and now she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. She had thought that by betraying James, she was securing her future, but in reality, she had destroyed it. In the end, both Emily and Daniel were prisoners of the past, bound by the choices they had made and the consequences they could never escape. The revenge that had consumed them had left them hollow, and the lives they had sought to build had crumbled into dust. The darkness they had unleashed on each other had claimed them both. leaving only shadows where once there had been light. Daniel Blackwood stood in his office. The vast cityscape sprawled out beneath him, twinkling in the night like a sea of diamonds. It was a view that once filled him with pride, a reminder of how far he had come. But tonight, it felt distant, almost meaningless. He was a man who had everything: wealth, power, influence. But the emptiness inside him had only grown. The revenge he had so meticulously planned and executed had left him cold, unfulfilled, and haunted by the ghosts of his past. For months he had watched as Emily and Mark's lives unraveled, each blow he delivered calculated and devastating. And yet, standing here now, he realized that the satisfaction he had anticipated never came. The victory was hollow, the triumph meaningless. All that remained was the lingering bitterness of regret. Leah had become the center of his world, the one thing he had left that mattered. But even that connection was fragile. He saw the confusion in her eyes, the unspoken questions she was too afraid to ask. The distance between them grew each day, a chasm that his wealth and power could never bridge. He had tried to shield her from the truth, to keep her safe, but in doing so, he had pushed her further away. Unable to shake the thoughts that plagued him, Daniel found himself reaching for something he hadn't touched in years. He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out an old photograph, carefully pieced back together after he had once torn it apart in a fit of rage. The image showed a younger, happier version of himself, standing alongside Emily and Mark, all three of them smiling, blissfully unaware of the storm that would one day tear them apart. As he stared at the photograph, a knot formed in his stomach. He had spent so many years consumed by hatred, by the need to make them pay for what they had done. But now, as he looked at the faces in the picture, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. If all of this had been for nothing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned just as the door to his office creaked open. It was Leah, her small frame silhouetted against the light from the hall. She looked hesitant, unsure if she should be there, but there was a determination in her eyes that Daniel hadn't seen before. "Dad," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you?" Daniel nodded, motioning for her to come in. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and approached his desk. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. I talked to Mom today," Leah said, her eyes searching his for a reaction. Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. Emily, the name hung in the air like a ghost, a reminder of everything he had tried to bury. "What did she say?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Leah hesitated, then took a deep breath. "She told me about you, about who you were before all of this, about how much you loved me." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Leah, But before he could finish, Leah cut him off. "Why didn't you tell me the truth, Dad? Why didn't you tell me that you're my real father?" The question hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He had spent years hiding the truth, convincing himself that it was for Leah's own good. But now, faced with her directness, he realized that his lies had only caused more pain. "I thought I was protecting you," Daniel said quietly. "I didn't want you to get caught up in everything that happened. I didn't want you to suffer because of my mistakes." Leah's eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "I've been suffering, Dad. Ever since you took me away from Mom, I felt like a part of me was missing. And now, I know why." Daniel felt his own eyes begin to sting with tears he hadn't shed in years. "I'm sorry, Leah. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of Daniel's confession hanging in the air. Finally, Leah took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel allowed himself to embrace her fully, to let go of the walls he had built around his heart. "I just want us to be a family again," Leah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Daniel held her tightly, his own tears now flowing freely. "We will be, Leah. I promise you we will be." But even as he made that promise, Daniel knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He had spent years destroying the lives of those who had wronged him, but now he was faced with the challenge of rebuilding what little remained. He had to make amends, not just for Leah's sake, but for his own. The next day, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He arranged a meeting with Emily. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just the two of them. He needed to face her, to confront the reality of what he had done, and to find a way to move forward. When Emily arrived, the tension between them was palpable. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. The distance that had grown between them over the years now, more evident than ever. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Emily, I know I can't undo what's been done. I know I can't change the past. But for Leah's sake, we need to find a way to move forward. She deserves better than this." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "I never thought it would come to this, James. I never thought we would end up here." "I didn't either," Daniel admitted. "But we have a choice now. We can either keep tearing each other apart, or we can try to make things right for her." Emily sighed, the weight of the past heavy on her shoulders. "I just want Leah to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." "Then let's work together to make that happen," Daniel said, his voice firm with resolve. "No more lies, no more games. Let's put Leah first, for once." It wasn't a perfect resolution. The wounds between them were deep, and the scars would never fully heal. But as they sat there, facing the broken pieces of their past, both Daniel and Emily knew that they had to try. For Leah, for the family they had once dreamed of, and for the chance to finally find peace. And so, with a hesitant but shared commitment, they agreed to begin anew. It would take time, patience, and forgiveness, things that neither of them had much practice in. But it was a start. As Daniel walked away from that meeting, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, the darkness that had consumed him began to lift, if only just a little. He knew he had a long way to go, but for Leah, for the future she deserved, he was willing to try. In the end, Daniel Blackwood, once James Adams, realized that revenge had not brought him the closure he sought. Only by letting go of the past could he begin to heal the wounds he had inflicted, both on others and on himself. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the horizon as Daniel Blackwood walked along the quiet path leading to the park where he had agreed to meet Emily. It had been weeks since their last conversation in the cafe, and in that time, both of them had made an effort to rebuild the fragile truce they had established. But tonight felt different. There was an air of finality, as if everything was leading to this moment. As Daniel approached the bench where Emily was already seated, he noticed a tension in her posture, a rigidity that hadn't been there before. He sat down beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Thank you for meeting me," Emily said finally, her voice subdued. She didn't look at him, instead staring straight ahead, her gaze distant. "Of course," Daniel replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He could sense that something was on her mind, something that went beyond their usual discussions about Leah. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, a reminder of the quietness of the world around them. Finally, Emily took a deep breath and turned to face Daniel, her expression unreadable. "Daniel," she began, her voice soft but steady, "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. There was an intensity in her eyes that made his heart pound in his chest. He nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. Emily hesitated, then pressed on, her words measured and deliberate. "I've been carrying a secret for years, something I kept from you because I thought it would protect us both. But now I see that hiding the truth only made things worse." "What is it, Emily?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He braced himself for whatever was about to come, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering her courage. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "The truth is, Daniel, Leah isn't Mark's daughter. She's yours. She's always been yours." The world seemed to stop. Time froze as Daniel's mind struggled to process what he had just heard. For a moment, he felt as though he couldn't breathe, as though the ground beneath him had vanished. His entire world, the very foundation upon which he had built his life for the past 7 years, was suddenly thrown into chaos. What are you saying?" Daniel stammered, his voice shaking. "How could you?" "I'm sorry," Emily interrupted, her voice cracking with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then. I was scared, angry, and I made a terrible mistake. I lied to you, to Mark, to everyone. I told you that Leah was Mark's child because I wanted to hurt you, because I wanted to push you away. But the truth is, she's yours, Daniel. She's always been yours." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Daniel felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Anger, disbelief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He had spent years believing a lie, years consumed by hatred and revenge for something that had never been true. And in that pursuit, he had nearly destroyed the one thing that truly mattered. "Why?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong, Daniel. I was so wrong. I thought I could control everything, that I could protect myself by keeping the truth hidden. But I see now that I was only hurting everyone, especially Leah. She deserves to know who her real father is. She deserves to know the truth." Daniel sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. Everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, it had all been for a lie. The anger he had nurtured, the revenge he had so meticulously planned, suddenly seemed meaningless, like ashes slipping through his fingers. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. A deep, profound sense of clarity. For the first time in years, Daniel saw the path forward, not through the lens of revenge, but through the possibility of redemption. He looked at Emily, his own eyes filled with unshed tears. "We've both made mistakes, Emily, terrible mistakes. But if Leah is our daughter, if she's truly mine, then we have to do right by her. We have to give her the life she deserves." Together, Emily nodded, relief flooding her features as she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "we have to do this for her." In that moment, something shifted between them. The bitterness, the resentment, the years of pain. They didn't vanish, but they no longer held the same power over them. There was a chance, however small, for healing, for rebuilding what had been broken. For Leah. As they stood to leave, Daniel reached out and took Emily's hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. They walked away from the park together, side by side, ready to face the difficult road ahead. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worth having ever was. But for the first time, they were willing to try, for Leah, for their future, for a second chance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, Daniel knew that this was the beginning of something new. The darkness that had once consumed him was beginning to lift, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. And with that hope, he realized, came the possibility of redemption. Not just for himself, but for the family they could still be.